This is GM Josh Friedel, and today I'll be doing GM Choice, which is my favorite lecture because I can choose anything I want, which works out pretty well. I decided to choose a game that I saw from the FIDE Grand Prix, which is currently going on in Berlin. And it was a game between Rapport and Vladimir Fedoseev. Really fascinating game, and I kind of just like choosing games which I find very interesting to go over. You can approach it from two angles when you prepare lectures. Basically, you can approach it from, all right, this is going to be extremely educational for these purposes, and you show it. Or you can basically go, this looks just like fun, so let me show this. And I think this falls into the second category a bit more, but there are still plenty of things we can learn from this game. A reminder also that I am reading the YouTube chat, so if I ask questions or have you guys say things, I will be seeing those. I will be seeing your comments on YouTube. So, without further ado, it was a Nimzo-Indian, one of my favorite openings, kind of for both colors. It's just a very rich opening with lots of different structures, and I find that it doesn't really get too boring. Hey Davina, how's it going? Queen c2, castles a3. Bishop takes c3 check, queen takes c3, b6. So very, very standard, very standard Nimzo-Indian. I would say that, at least from personal tastes, I always found these queen c2 lines to be almost obnoxious because it's already move 7 and you haven't developed any of your minor pieces apart from the knight which got captured. And all of this just to capture the two bishops and keep your pawn structure nice and pretty without taking with the b-pawn. I always found it to be, again, slightly obnoxious, but at the same time, of course, it's a personal opinion. Obviously, it's fine for white, right? But it's more that white has to be very careful because they are behind the development. So it's one thing that you've taken the two bishops, but you have to be very careful with how you proceed from here. So white plays bishop g5, which is typical. Bishop e7. And I would say that James commented that Rapport is a wild man. That's absolutely true. But one of the things I've noticed is that he used to be regularly rated around 2,700. And in fact, when he beat up on me, that's about what his rating was. But at that time, he would play all sorts of random openings. He'd get dead lost positions against 2,400s. Against me, he actually blitzed out like 20 moves of theory. I felt cheated in a sense. But he would get all these awful positions and come back. And one of the things I've noticed in the last year or year and a half, maybe 2 years, is that all of a sudden he's playing slightly more mainstream theory, but with a twist. And all of a sudden his rating's almost 2,770, and I don't think that's an accident. So I think he's one of the very best players in the world right now, and one of the reasons is because he learned how to play openings, not some huge opening expert, but just decent openings that surprise people, and he kind of goes from there. He also is not really picky about trying to choose the most popular line. So for example, in this position, the most popular move is f3. And then after h6, bishop h4, d5, this is a whole big line. So one of the main features here is that if white takes immediately, you actually take with the e-pawn with the idea that after e3, rook e8, this pressure on the e3 pawn is quite annoying. So typically white plays e3 first, knight b d7, and now takes, and you get this endgame, which has been around for centuries. Okay, centuries might be an exaggeration, but it's been around a long time. And the whole idea is that if you take on c7, I go here, and I'm forking these two thingamajigs, and that's very, very annoying for whites. So you don't really want your center to get decimated, especially when you're behind in development, which still matters in an endgame. So white usually goes back, back to d5, bishop f2, and then black wants to open the position. Not because white has the two bishops, obviously bishops love open positions, but because black's ahead in development. So even though it's an endgame, black's lead in development tends to go well. And again, it's all theoretical, and there's still playable options for both colors. I think black's considered okay, but I'm not exactly an expert in that line. I usually play slightly differently as black myself. And then there's e3 as a move, and then you can play d6 usually, knight b d7, and white can play knight f3 or knight e2 or almost anything. Even f3 here is a move. So there's endless options, there really are. Rapport chooses knight h3. And this is the kind of move that you feel like any normal master would yell at their student for playing a move like this. And the fact is that it's very important to learn not to put knights on the edge first. So say if you're rated 1200 and you're looking at this game, don't play moves like this. Just put your pieces in the center, get castled, okay? Keep your life simple. But once you learn about structures more, you realize that the knight on h3 actually makes a fair amount of sense. And one of the reasons is that, first of all, it defends this bishop, which can be somewhat useful. But also, white wants to be playing with f3, e4 someday, and the knight often will slide back to f2 where it's quite useful. And the reason why white goes for f3, f3 also, I should mention, looks like a weird move. You're behind the development, just get your pieces out. But the whole point of f3 is that it dulls both the bishop and the knight. It makes both of these pieces worse, which is why you can get away with a move like this. So knight h3 is kind of a clever attempt to say, well, maybe I'll play e3, maybe I'll play f3. I'm holding onto my bishop. Just a way to kind of make life more interesting. So black plays h6 and plays d6 here. So I don't know, in my view, the most testing move here should be d5, trying to play in the center. And the idea is that after takes, e takes e3, for instance, one advantage that this has for white is that your pawn structure is like this, meaning that moves like rook e8 don't do as much because e3 is defended. But black can play c5, and then the idea is to play knight c6 and target this d pawn, which can't be defended as well because the knight's committed here. So the basic, I'm not really trying to teach you guys theory so much, but it's more about why each opening move exists for that reason, and each opening move kind of has a slight defect to it. So the knight on h3 can't control the d4 square as well. The pawn on f3 lets go of e3 a little bit. So there's always something, and there's a reason why usually there are lots of options and no clear best move. Black can also think about playing c5, which is its own kind of mess. But I do want to get into this game because it is quite interesting. I just wanted to show a few things about the opening. So d6 was played. Rapport plays f3, knight bd7, e4, and now c5. A very typical thing. Black has a very solid setup here, but it's also a bit passive. And if you allow white to just build and castle, eventually they build an attack. This is not something you'd like so much. So you have to try to counter the center in some way. So Rapport ignores this. And this, I think, is an interesting moment because black has lots of different options to improve. They can play queen e7 is a possible move, but the problem is that it walks into e5. So queen e7 would be a normal move. It doesn't work as well here, I don't believe. Rook e8 is a move, which was played in the game, and rook c8. Personally, I kind of like rook c8. The main reason for this is that you're kind of aiming up the rook with the queen, but there's also a very concrete purpose, which, let's say this happens, and knight takes c5. And this could have happened in the game, by the way. So if white tries to take everything, which again was very much like the game, and play b4, the rook on c8 is a lot more active than the rook on e8. So you can play something like knight b3, rook d1 to prevent the knight from going to d4, and then d5. And because the rook is open on the c file, you're going to have lots and lots of counterplay here. So even though your pawn structure has been a little bit messed up, you still have a development lead because white's not castled yet. White doesn't have a nice safe king. Their rook on h1 can't play. So I think that this position would offer black more chances, personally. In the game, he played rook e8, and it gets pretty similar. He takes. So here, I'd actually recommend taking with the pawn because I think that trying to take with the knight is a little bit ambitious here because those lines don't work out as well. So I think taking with the pawn's a bit better. And then after castles queenside, queen b6, life kind of continues, honestly. Like the game is very unclear. I would say, though, that d5 is coming, so probably white has to do something interesting, like maybe sacrifice a pawn this way. The idea being that after knight takes, bishop takes, these pawns are really terrible with the king on g8 in a middle game. So you probably should actually take with the pawn. And now just a move like bishop d3. And black's position is actually weird because it's black's up a pawn, but their pieces have trouble moving. So, and eventually white will maybe try to attack with something like this, I don't know. So I feel this position is quite unclear. But the move knight takes c5 happened. And again, it looks reasonable, but I think with the rook on e8, it's just not really as good. Rapport goes for this endgame. And often this endgame is kind of not much. Like, usually black brings the king in, brings the rooks to the center, it feels fine. But white can immediately play b4 and force the knight back, which is a problem. And now the variations actually get quite interesting. Knight b3 was played. Knight d7 actually might be slightly better, with the idea of trying to play rook c8, knight e5, and target the c-pawn. He was likely worried about something like castles, and now this pawn's not defensible. Again, if black had time to do this, not king d6, but king e7. Black would probably just be completely fine. But they don't actually have time, so they go for something like knight e5. Rook takes d6, and here black has a nice tactic with knight takes c4. But even here, it's not over. This is actually quite interesting. You have bishop takes c4. And here, black actually can play both rooks here. And I guess I'll ask you guys a question. Which rook do you think would be better? So again, on YouTube, feel free to shout out. And again, for a move like this, having reasons is nice. If you say rook a c8, that's nice, but like, why is rook a c8 better? All right, I see one a rook, one e rook, two a rooks. All right, a rooks are winning. Do the a rooks have it? F rook, oh my goodness, that doesn't even exist. Get two more e rooks, okay. So yeah, there are things like, well, the kingside rook already has moved, but I would tell you that that kind of thinking can get you into trouble, because sometimes you have to move a piece a bunch of times. It's just the way chess works. So it's really about which rook either serves more of a purpose, not a porpoise, or is less in the way. And it turns out that the e rook is not very well placed. After rook a c8, white can play rook d4. And this is actually very annoying. It looks like this move doesn't do any good, because black will play here. But now you play rook d7, and there's a very, very big problem. If you play, first of all, if you take the bishop immediately, I play king b2, rook c8. And the easiest for white is actually just to take, allow this check, takes this knight, takes here. And the whole point is that white has a much better king. You'll notice that black's king on g8 is just kind of sitting there and does nothing, while the white king is just marching up the board. So this kind of position actually is very, very bad for black, in my opinion. So the natural move would be something like this, but here white has a very, very nice move. Rook d4 is to provoke the move e5, so that rook d7 carries a bit more weight. It also means like it's not possible for black to just play bishop c6, for example, because there's always bishop takes f7 check ideas and things like this. So it's basically to provoke the move e5. But why does this not work? What move does white have here, which is quite strong? b5 doesn't actually help you very much, because I think I can take it due to the pin. Oops. Think about the rook on e8 and ways in which that piece might not be so strong. Very nice. And the fact that this hits f6 with tempo is actually a very big problem, because after rook takes c4 check king b1, you don't want to go to b2 because it allows rook c8 and then there's rook c2 check. So b1 is actually important. And now you have to take time to play the move king g7. And now when you take this pawn, the bishop has to move back. You play knight e3. The knight can go to d5. You just are up a pawn with a really great position. So it looks like rook a c8, is the more logical move. But because knight g4 is such an important tempo on the f pawn, it actually doesn't work as well. So rook e c8 is actually the better move. So now if rook d4, for example, e5, rook d7, there's another perk, which is that after bishop a6, the a7 pawn doesn't hang. So that's another very big advantage. So this kind of thing would actually be fine for black. So king b2, rook takes c4, knight g4. So you go for this anyway, but here you don't have to defend against knight takes f6 so clearly, because it doesn't like win a rook or anything. So you can actually just activate your own rook. And I don't think white should actually take this pawn, because I think allowing rook c2 with both rooks and the bishop is too dangerous. So probably you go back here, rook c3, and then just rook e1. I definitely think white's still better. I think that this bishop is not that great right now, and rook d7 is always in the air, so you have to maybe try like rook c7 someday or something. And eventually white can just try to build on the king side maybe. And the white king also has more potential. But I definitely think black's kind of in the game here. Instead, that might have been possible. Let me check. So after rook d4, in the line with rook a c8, so rook d4. So if you play b5, I think again I have knight g4. And this tempo is just super annoying for you. And the whole idea is if you play a move like, say, king g7, now I can play knight e3, and then I probably will just gang up on the c-pawn, or maybe just play rook d7 here, and it feels like black's very passive. This position probably does not look very good. So again, I haven't looked at every single line, right? But it's a reasonable question, so thank you for asking. So in the game, black played knight b3, rook d1, a5. And here life gets very, very complicated. Already Rapport has to make very, very difficult decisions. So here he has to choose between capturing this pawn or playing rook d3, trying to go after this knight, or at least make the knight worse. So which move do you think you guys would go for? Rook d3 or rook takes d6? These are your options. Of course, if you think you see a better move, go ahead, but I really feel like you kind of want to choose one of those moves, because otherwise black's just going to take and bring the rook in, and you're going to feel kind of sad. Also, d5 could become a move. I don't know. So the idea of a5 is basically to help save this knight. Otherwise, moves like rook d3 are just going to win the knight someday. So rook takes d6 is what was played in the game. The question is it the better move? Like, which move do you prefer? I actually think the choice is not easy at all, so I'm kind of curious. I bet you put this position in front of several GMs, they're all going to choose different ones. So I think if after rook d3, black had to move the knight, Rapport would have played this move for sure. Or if they have to play a4, taking the pressure off and making this rook less active, for sure he would have played this. But I'm pretty sure the move he was afraid of was a takes b4. So you can actually take this pawn back, but then moves like rook a1 check come into the play. But I actually think you can think about rook takes b3. And the whole point is that now b takes a3, rook b1, a2, rook a1. And black's down a piece, but they have an awful lot of counterplay, especially with that a-pawn, and white's still not developed. Just because it's an endgame doesn't mean you don't develop, right? So a move like d5 could be problematic. I still think, though, this would be pretty good for white. The key, though, is that you have to find a way to get your pieces out. So I actually very much like this move king d2, just trying to get the king over. And again, it's very complicated. I don't know how clear it is, but I definitely think white's on top here. In the game, he actually went with rook takes d6 instead. So rook takes d6 is definitely quite a reasonable option. So his opponent played rook a1 check. And now once again, you have a very, very difficult choice in my view. And that is whether you play knight d1 or rook d1. And this is just to show you how difficult this position was to play. I mean, these are not easy choices to make. They both have very severe drawbacks. So I guess first of all, before you start to discuss which move you like what are the potential pluses and minuses of rook d1 and of knight d1? So it's been pointed out that knight d1 allows king f2. This is absolutely true. That's a very nice perk of knight d1, that it allows the king a nice escape route. The king wants to get out of dodge here. The king on e1 is not very good. Even in the endgame, king position can really be a problem. So I think that's a big plus. Anything else? There's another perk of knight d1 which I feel like should be mentioned. Well, eventually a king march might be a very nice idea, but we've talked about that already. So knight d1 does allow king f2. What's another perk of knight d1 that's more straightforward? It's to do with this rook. Keep in mind that the knight really can't go anywhere for now. Like, it's going to be pinned for a while, most likely. So. Yeah, this is definitely one. So knight d1 allows rook takes b6, and it allows king f2. A potential drawback, though, is that the knight doesn't defend the center as well from d1, and you are walking into a pin, right? So it's a really difficult decision to make. Obviously, it's not just about concepts, right? You have to do the concepts, but you also have to calculate what happens. Everything is very concrete when the position becomes very complicated. So I would say that it's nice to have a grasp of what the concepts are. Sometimes you can figure out, well, I just want to keep my rook active and that's more important, and things like this. But ultimately you have to calculate. So the fact that the knight is pulled off of this e4 pawn allows black to play the idea f5. So we still get to take on b6, bishop a8, but now our center is kind of getting under attack. And if the center opens, that can be very bad for our knight. So we play e5. And the idea is now that if rook d8 trying to target our knight, we can play rook d6 always. But the game is actually not over yet. Black has a really great resource here, and I'm curious if you guys can find it. Finding resources for your opponent that is very strong is like a great skill to develop, because it helps you spot a lot of different things. So what can black try here? Their bishop's kind of out of the game. They have this knight pinned, but they can't really do much. Very good, Whipster. f6. And white actually has no great response to this. If they take the pawn, then rook d1, and there's a very big problem with this d1 knight. So if bishop e2, knight d4, all of a sudden white actually has some big problems to solve. I don't recommend that. You can play a move like f4, but that really opens up this bishop, and that gives black loads of extra options. So that's clearly not something you want either. So I think the best course of action is to ignore it with something like bishop e2. And this isn't the only option for black, but taking the pawn makes sense to me. King f2. And now play could go something like knight d4, rook e1, rook a2, knight c3, rook b2, just trying to keep pressure up here. And now just king f1, just dropping back to make sure my pieces can move. And if e4, trying to open things, f4, keeping things closed. I still like white, but I would say that this position is complete mess. Like, this is not easy to play. And of course, the players have to kind of try to figure all this stuff out. It's easier after the game when you can pause and think for a long time, come check with the computer and stuff like that, then things become a bit easier to figure out. But I would say that just in general, the amount of resources that are possible in a position this rich is quite something. So I can assure you that the players were not underestimating what was here. So rook d1 was played. Fedoseev plays the very logical move, rook e8. So here there was a possibility of bishop d3 or bishop e2. He chose bishop e2. I kind of like bishop d3 better, but it's also very complicated. The main thing I'm going for here, though, is to complete my development and have everything defended. I feel like the bishop on e2 sometimes comes under more fire with a rook on a2. So one possibility here is that here you have to take with the knight, I believe. Rook a4, you play b5. And it's weird because you've given up this square, but this bishop is also completely worthless. So for me, this is a bit of a mixed bag. Like, the knight on c5 could be annoying. A move like this, I think, is playable. I don't know. Overall, I'd say that allowing this is not so easy to do. In the game, he played bishop e2. And this is where things got really crazy. You thought they were crazy so far, but no. Fedoseev plays knight c1. And this is kind of the fun thing. It's a crazy position to begin with, so no matter who's playing, it's going to be fun. But I would say both Rapport and Fedoseev are players known for their creativity, so you're going to see a lot of fun stuff. And trust me, guys, it's just beginning. So what can he do, right? This knight on c1, but there's no immediate threat. So Rapport plays knight g4. Rook 8 a2. So I don't know. Here I was getting nervous for white. The only reason why white's not dead lost is because this bishop still can't get into the game. If that bishop ever gets into the game, white's probably done. So, but it's not so easy to actually do. So Rapport grabs this pawn with check, which looks brave, but is absolutely the correct decision in my view. And here, Fedoseev, at least in my view, had a very tricky decision on what to play here between king g7, hitting the knight, trying to gain that tempo, or king f8. Which one do you think you guys would do? I think he chose correctly in the game, but it's, of course, very complicated. Yeah, I mean, king f8 is what was played, and that's the main advantage. Oh man, I'm getting asked why I'm wearing a mask, just not in English now. It's getting really crazy. All right, yeah, so it looks weird to play king f8 to me at first, because if you allow like e5, rook d8, you're going to get mated, but this bishop is hanging with check, and there's not so much you can do about that so easily. King g7 was definitely possible, but as was pointed out, knight h5 check, king g6, knight f4, king g5. At first I thought this was actually very tricky because the knight is going to get hit next move, but white has a very, very cool move here. Yeah, like what do you do? I mean, like I understand that the knight's back on f4 defending stuff, but at the same time, that king is kind of going for a ride here. h4, it would be nice, but after king takes knight, I don't think you actually checkmate me. I think you're going to get checkmated yourself, more likely. g3 is not a bad move, but I think there's a stronger one. Like after g3, there's still e5 moves to contend with and stuff like that. Knight h3, knight g1 would be quite something. Wow. I have to just put this on the board. Knight g1. This is definitely a way to go. I feel like, though, you're asking for huge amounts of trouble. Apart from just what happens if black lets your knight be terrible and just like improves a piece or something, I think something like this could prove to be problematic. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The rooks defend each other. This is an example of how to lose as black, but I don't know, like if I just play king e5, I don't actually know what you're going to do. Like here, maybe, even just knight takes e2 doesn't look, oh no, I don't want to take. Maybe f5 or something. I'm not sure, like it's still very difficult to move. The idea though is actually a good one, but you should not put your knight on g1 first. You should play king f2 right away. And this move is kind of amazing because you're just going to take this knight, right? So it's very, very difficult for black to do anything here. So they probably have to defend it, and now you can play king e3, for example. If rook a3 check, you just play bishop d3. There's no follow-up. And after e5, you can play knight check and bishop d3. And everything's covered. Everything's defended. There's no checks. This pin is really annoying. So after rook c3, now you can drop back. Everything's nice. Everything's clear. You have your extra pawn. This bishop is not very good. So I think this would be good for white. But this is obviously like very, very difficult. And the cool thing is after takes, you have a cool trick. You play takes, so the rooks are interacting. Rook takes rook, and now you have knight h3 check to make sure there's no knight takes knight, and then you take the rook. And this knight is, like white's just up in exchange on a pawn. 2 pawns for nothing. So king g7 looks adventurous, but actually helps white. So he plays king f8 instead. And here, Rapport decides to go on an adventure. He didn't have to. I think that there was actually a stronger move. A deer jumps into a convenience store. That's funny. I have to say I grew up in New Hampshire, so there's a fair amount of deer, like not a crazy amount, but they're not the smartest of animals, I will tell you. They're not as dumb as moose, for sure, but they do some dumb things, I must say. Probably you're not supposed to talk about the intelligence of animals when you're doing a chess video, but we're here, it's fine. It's my last week, I'm not gonna get fired for it, right? This is the key, you do it on your last week, you engage in controversy. But seriously, what would you guys do as white here? I'm curious, how many of you would go on an adventure? How many of you would try to defend? It's a very tricky situation. Because the funny thing about this move is that, I don't think it's best, but I can totally see why he played it, and I think it's very likely I would have tried it myself. F3. Yes. Yes, once f3 has been played, it's all over. There's no way to improve your position, right? Rapport did in fact play king f2 and just pitched the bishop and said, whatever, I'm getting out of here. Yeah, we got to do a bet for the number of mask questions per video, and then the winner gets something. I feel like this would be a great contribution. Oh, deleted. Look at that. Boom. And so you guys know I'm not gasping for air. I'm doing just fine. It is fashionable. It's been pointed out to me that the more of my face I cover, the better looking I am. So I'm going for it. Anyway, guys, so king f2 again is, that's not how king f2 works. He's shy. Man, everyone's giving me a hard time today. It's brutal. So king f2 is what Rapport played, which is a really interesting move and not a bad one. But I think there was something a bit stronger. So see if you guys can find it. You guys are like, what? We're looking at chess still? What's going on? I thought we were talking about mask fashion or something. Ugh. Nothing? My goodness. The thing is, this move is actually, there aren't that many moves for white that don't lose on the spot, so it doesn't give you a huge range of options. King h8 for black would be quite a provocative move, I must say. But maybe it's possible. So e5 does threaten rook d8 and mate. The problem you have here is that you're not going to be able to force that move in so easily. So one problem might simply be just knight takes bishop. Because if you're pinned now, you can't play rook d8 check. If I try to do it, Lichess won't let me. It's kind of annoying. So if takes and you skewer the piece, right? So knight takes e2 is probably just a very simple knight takes e2 is probably a very simple problem. e5 is very tempting. I can understand why you do it. But and so if you play like takes king f2, I can probably just take, check here, take this rook, and that's not going to be a whole lot of fun. So I don't recommend e5. You can play knight d7 check, but after king e7, I don't know that you've improved your position either. It's a very simple move, guys. Don't try to look for anything too crazy. Rapport already took care of that for us. But I have a feeling he thought that this move was just too passive and that something bad would happen. Maybe he saw something very specific. Yeah, Andreas, very nice. Bishop f1 is basically the only move left. But what's amazing about this is that there's not really anything black can do that's so effective. So for example, the line I have here, again, obviously this was with some computer help, but the fact is that like knight d3 check or this move, bishop c8, it does prevent knight d7, which is very nice. And it's threatening here, so white just shuts him down with e5. And black almost has no moves, like white can just kind of improve at will now. So probably black will grab an exchange with check, takes, rook takes d1, rook takes h1, h3. But I actually think this position is extremely bad for black. White's going to play here. This bishop is going to be basically a dead piece. And white can outmaneuver black at will, slowly start pushing the queen side. And I think that black is probably going to be losing here. I would say either lost or very close to lost. And it's mainly because this bishop can never ever play. So when you're playing down a piece, it's usually not a good thing. And here, I think it's not an exception. So I definitely think this wasn't so simple. And you have to really realize like how difficult this is. But I think this exchange sack is very good for white. But it could also be he just rejected bishop f1 because, let me put it this way, I understand his decision very well because bishop f1 looks so passive that, oh man, like what am I going to do after this move? Whereas king f2, it's like at least I'm doing something. And to be fair to him, this is not a bad move. I think white still has a decent position, but black does have more chances now. So his idea is basically, look, I'm out of here. Rook takes c2, king g3. He's just like, peace, I'm gone. And it's actually pretty effective. Rook c2. And the question is, what does he do now? This is another very important move that he plays, a really nice move. So I think e5, you have to watch out because I can play knight e2 check. And then I have rook takes c4 with check quite often. I could also think about just taking, knight here. And then the problem is I'm going to take everything with check. You're not going to get an opportunity to checkmate me with rook d8, I don't think. So I don't think that worked quite as well. So he plays king h4. This is just a beautiful move. He's basically like, look, my king is an attacking piece and I'm going to use it. And this is a really nice idea. One of the things I would say that gets underestimated a lot is this kind of king run in an endgame. And apart from it just being objectively a good move, I think it's also very annoying to deal with practically. It's easy to try to play against an opponent's king when they're kind of a sitting duck or they're not active. It's much easier to play. When all of a sudden their king starts wreaking havoc and running all over the board, screaming, it's just very annoying to deal with. Like, how do you deal with this stupid king? It's just going to keep moving up. So for example, after rook takes c4, white can just play here. And what is black doing? Like, how do you stop this king from just ravaging you? For example, if here, I can simply check here. And now you either have to let me take this pawn someday, walk into this fork. Actually, this knight d6 fork is the main problem. So like, for example, if king f8, I can play knight d6. And this is a big problem. So rook c2, I think, is a better try. But here I can simply take this pawn. Rook g2, e5, so I'm threatening this. You have to go back. I take this knight. And black could take here. And apparently this position's unclear. But I was kind of surprised. Like, my initial reaction is, oh, this has to be great for white. Like, look at our king. Look at how passive they are. Apparently, computer is not that impressed. But I feel like for a human being, this position is pretty good. Like, I think for most of us, we'll find our way to be okay here for white. But apparently, it's still quite unclear. So this would have been the best try, but not so easy for any human being to play. And that's kind of what I mean. When you're dealing with this king running up the board, waving his arms like a madman, it's just very difficult to actually deal with. So in the game, he played this, which is a very logical move. So here, actually, Rapport could have played knight check and knight d6. And this is very boring, but it's also very strong, because this knight is now not very good. And sorry, this bishop is now not very good. So for example, if it goes, it probably should just go to a8. But we can always just play b5 at some point, and like this bishop is just stuck. And black has no moves, so eventually white just improves their pawns. So this would be actually quite good for white. In the game, he played knight h5 check, which I think is a bit less strong. And here, this is one of my favorite lines. So in the game, he played king g6, which is actually quite a bad blunder. Although the reasons for it are quite complex. So he played king f8, I think, is a better move, making sure this king stays safe. It's funny, like, one of the toughest calls to make in these positions is knowing when you should get adventurous with your king, and this was a pretty good adventure overall, and knowing when you should not get adventurous. And I'd say black's king, because there are so many potential mating threats, should not get adventurous at all. Black's king should stay nice and calm. White's king getting adventurous, though, makes sense. So check, rook d1. So this looks like, oh man, rook d7's coming. This is just juicy. But of course, black has a very nice defensive resource here. And these lines get real fun. Well, e5 I don't think is going to save you. I can play check and probably take your bishop. But I can probably also checkmate you, right? Like, there has to be a mate here. I refuse to believe. Check in here, perhaps? I guess there's bishop c8, though. That's annoying. Oh, wait, even here I can try to mate you. Check. Takes, threatening mate. You have this. Maybe I don't care. Rook f4. Okay, I got two adventures. I'm sorry. This is what happens when I don't prepare. But okay, I can at the very least just take your bishop, right? Like, this should be winning pretty easily. Bishop d5, very good. Cutting off communication. But of course, we're not nearly done. We're nowhere near completed. We play rook b8, best move. Now, once again, only one move for black. Very good, Avinash. Rook a8. Bishop still defending the rook. Tactics check out. So we take. Bishop takes. Rook check. King f8. And here, believe it or not, white has to try to draw. We're down a piece. And a move like this, I think, runs into this, and then this is the key. Our bishop defends. So white actually has only one way to draw here. But it is quite a nice one. Keep in mind that sometimes you're down a piece. You gotta cash in. Not cash in, but. And I don't know where you mean cashing in with the bishop. Like I think that black really didn't have any need to try to. I don't think black needed to cash in anywhere. Like he's kind of staying up a piece, yeah. E5 is possible, but it does look slow, so it does give me a tempo to try to deal with this. Maybe the simplest way, or no, bishop d3, that's a lot of material. Maybe just, I can't go back. Why is that annoying? Maybe here. Because now the rook probably has to move again, and then you go here, and then the bishop kind of can go back if it needs to. Maybe that's a problem. I'm not sure. Yeah, you can play rook takes f7 check. Very good, Andreas. Takes, check. You can't go to g6 because you get mated embarrassingly. You have to go back and then here, and you can't stop this perpetual without giving up way too much material. Pretty cool, huh? So that's how this game could have gone, in fact, if black had played it well. But yeah, quite something. So king g6 was played, and Rapport plays rook d8, obvious enough, playing for mate. Rook back. Rook hd1. Takes c4. Rapport takes and plays here. And then this was the moment where I think they calculated different lines, and I think Rapport saw a bit more. And again, it could have been time pressure. This was such a crazy game. I mean, to play this game on no time is very difficult. So Fedoseev took on e4. Maybe the best try was to play king h7. But after rook takes a8, knight d3, for example, you have to try to prevent e5. Obviously, e5 is not possible yet, but it would have been possible if you take this pawn. Rook a7, king g6, rook d7 is very annoying, dislodging this knight. So if something like knight takes b4, you play rook d8, again threatening this, king h7, and now the move f4, and this is so nasty. Because you can't take this pawn due to knight f6, and I'm just going to march my pawn up the board and then checkmate you with knight f6 and rook g8, and you can't really stop it effectively. It's very annoying. So the king can be such an important piece in the endgame. So like rook c6 I thought was a decent try, but now I play rook f8, hitting the pawn, and g4, and once again, either this is coming or g5 more likely. And it's very sad, you just get mated. So quite something. And just to show you an example of how it could happen, let's say I play like knight back to d3, for example. I don't know what the most accurate move order. Probably it's just, oh no, check allows this, so I should not do that. Probably just g5. And now I'm threatening check and mate. And if I take, then I just simply take with the pawn, and once again, threatening check and mate. And if you ever try to move this, then I have all sorts of options, but the simplest is just to take, and this pawn is so good that you're probably just going to do this and mop up, and black is in no way able to fight against any of this. So just as an example of how things can go down. Also, I should point out king takes pawn is also very possible here and may even be just as strong. So having a good king is important in the endgame. That's the conclusion. In the game, though, he played bishop takes e4, which clearly he counted on. So the question is, what does Rapport do here? And I think this is where, again, he just calculated this part a little bit better than Fedoseev did. Of course, could have not gone down that way, but that's my suspicion. So I think if you do that, it's actually not so great, Avinash, because after check and g4, king here, I think you're actually forcing my king where it wants to go. My king wants to escape this way. And you don't quite have time to checkmate me. So I actually think this makes black's life better, not worse. f4, I think you're threatening mate, but I don't think I have to allow mate. Let me see what I would do. It's possible I would just sack a piece back, maybe something like this. So you can check and take this bishop, but then I take this pawn, and I don't think this has gone well for you either. My king is actually a lot safer now. Yeah, oops, sorry. Yeah, and anyway, don't be sorry about wrong suggestions. That's part of why we do this, right? So, and a lot of the times what I would say is that like several people suggested your line. So it's like if one of us, like for example, if one of you suggests a line that maybe didn't work, probably other people thought it worked too. So it's always good to suggest these things. We all learn stuff. And as you know, sometimes you suggest something and I have no idea why it doesn't work, or maybe it does work, you know. I try to prepare these lectures well, but there are definitely things I miss. E5 might have saved as well. I didn't see I don't remember exactly, but white has a really great move here though. And I believe Andreas found it. G4. This is what Rapport played, and it's an amazing move. If Rook G8, you're threatening to mate with knight F6, and after F5, you can play Rook D7, and then this mate is unstoppable as well. After takes, you simply take back, and game over. But of course, Fedoseev fought on. He found one move to stay in the game. That move is King H7. And now that Rapport takes, it's so much better. Like, keep in mind, he could have taken on E4 right away. But now after Rook takes E4 check, F5, you don't have time for Rook D7 because this hangs with check. So you have to play H3, and then after takes, King F7, I mean, this is not a clear position at all, in my opinion. Like after check, of course, after knight F6, probably white should draw, but it's definitely not that easy, right? Like this is not what you want. So G4 was a really nice move, and then takes. And here he should win easily enough. The problem is if Rook takes B4, you play E5 and you're still mating him. You haven't actually solved the mating net issue. So Fedoseev finds the only try, which is knight E5. And that's a good point, Suzanne, that the knight on C1 is definitely poor, and that contributes to this. If the knight on C1 were in the game, this would be probably a lot easier for black. So having a bad piece, even though it was an extra piece for a while, was not so great. So here he could win in several ways. He chooses knight F6 check and Rook D6, which I definitely think is perfectly reasonable. Knight E2. And here he basically just wants this knight to get to a good square. So how would you reposition this knight? Huh, that is funny, James. Rook takes b6 is probably good enough. I don't think there's anything wrong with the move. He actually chooses knight g8. And the purpose of this is that now after king g7, he takes this pawn, and the knight's ready to head to f5, where it's going to be very, very strong. So his repositioning of the knight is nice, and he also is improving, like, he's also taking a pawn while he does it, right? So here, rook takes e4 was played, knight f5 check. King h7, rook h6 check first, sorry. Rook takes b6, knight f4. And of course, what would the game be if he doesn't activate his king even further? King g5. And this is actually a problem because like he's still trying to mate black, which is quite funny. Like this king is still coming up and you still have to worry about getting mated. So it makes defense of this endgame where you're down a pawn even more difficult. So Fedoseev actually decides to play f6 check, which is a kind of a clever idea. So how does Rapport respond to this move, first of all? And I must say, this part of the game was calculated very well, because this is like not the easiest thing in the world. I would say it's harder to play black than white, but very good, Susan. King h6 is definitely best. If you take and allow rook takes b4, the game's simplified a bit. It's probably still winning, I would guess, but it's a little more complicated. Maybe also this check could be a possibility, because you can't go to g6, which is where you want to go because of this. Or wait, no, this actually just wins probably. That might actually mate. You have to play rook f4 or something, and okay, then I can just push. Yeah, okay. This is knight h3 check was not good, but you can probably take, if king h6 now, you can always go back to not get mated at least. Or wait, does this even work? Ah, you have check. It's always something, right? Like it's never so easy. But in general, king h6 is nice because you keep your passed pawn over here, and you're ready to start advancing. So after rook e2, he plays h4. King f7, rook b5, rook b2, rook b8. So he's basically just making this pawn dangerous, and then he'll try to win over here somehow. Knight d5, h5, e4. So Fedoseev's getting some counterplay, but it's a bit too little too late. And Rapport simply takes this pawn, right? Like, it looks like e4 is a blunder, but really black has just no move. Like, what can black even do? There's just nothing really, and eventually he'll play rook b7 check, dislodge this king, and start advancing the h pawn. So this was move 46 actually. So e4 was played, and then he takes this pawn, rook b6, rook b4, sorry. And here I find that Rapport played a really nice finish to this game, because it would be, I feel like it would be very, very easy to kind of get lazy in a position like this, and sometimes that's how you blow it. But I think Rapport was very, very thorough. He could have checked on b7, but I think he wants the rook on b8 so that his pawn can be escorted at some point. But rook b7 check was, of course, possible as well. I don't think it's bad or anything. Keep in mind, especially when you look at the later part of a game like this, like often you can win in many ways. It's not like their way is the only way. It's more important that you calculate it and you make sure you're being thorough. Maybe it would be better. I don't know that you have to pitch your pawn, but something like rook here, I'm suspecting he didn't like check and then some kind of just, pushing of this pawn. But I don't know. I mean, probably he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to play e4. But at this point, though, it shouldn't matter too much. Like, this is just too many passed pawns to deal with. But in any case, this was the moment. Knight takes f6 is a bit much, probably, right? Like, takes. g5. Maybe you're winning here, but I feel like this is maybe not necessary. It might be winning, though. Like, the pawns are just so annoying to defend against. g5 is possible. I like what he did quite a bit, though. He played the move b6. So this had to be very well calculated. So if rook takes b6, the idea is he simply trades and plays here, and this pawn is just not stoppable. And if knight takes b6, he plays knight takes f6, your idea. And this is very, very strong. Because he's pinned now, this is the difference. Because he's pinned, black can do nothing. So you can just do this, and this pawn just, like if king here, you just play here, and this pawn just marches up the board. And because of this pin, you really are you're just completely helpless. So in my opinion, this is a better version of knight takes f6. And if rook takes e4, he plays b7, rook b4, and then you've seen this rook endgame trick. This knight is actually irrelevant here. You play here, or rook g8, and then after takes, you check and win this rook. So kind of a normal rook ending trick. But this b6 move, it hangs two things, right? Like these are all moves which take pieces, but they all fail. So just because he's up a pawn and because the game is nearing its end, sort of, he still is very, very careful and calculates very accurately. So Fedoseev played f5, which is a fun move. But it doesn't really help. After takes, b7, knight f6, he finished it off with kind of a nice move, rook d8, making sure the knight cannot get to d7. And black resigned, because he's going to just queen next. And there's nothing really to to do about it. So overall, like a really fun game, and at the end, very well played too. Like this technique, I fast forwarded it to make sure I had a little bit of time, but there was so many like little details in this that were very nice. But overall, just a really nice game, a great illustration of king activity, and also just the amount of tactical resources that are possible in an endgame. Because both sides, as you saw, had so many tactics, and it's easy to get complacent when it's the endgame, but I would say, you know, a lot of my favorite games are where it's an endgame, but there's crazy tactics and there's still ways to try to mate your opponent. And trying to checkmate in the endgame is literally one of my favorite things in chess. So any game where that happens, I feel like I have to go over it. So that is it for me tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed this game. I will be back on Thursday evening doing Prepare Like a GM, I think the lecture is. I should probably know by now. But it's basically a lecture on preparation. So hopefully I'll have another game for you guys then. And so join me on Thursday night, and that will probably be my last lecture for you guys. So thanks again for joining me, and I will see you guys hopefully on Thursday. Have a good one.